with a peppers, right? You know, this is something that we can do with people wherever we are. So we want to say thank you for coming. You can see for the family that's with us on Facebook Live that we have folks here. Even though New York City is blanketed in snow today, we have the Kemetic, we have the followers, the people that hear the echo of our ancient Kemetic way that are here with us, and we welcome you on Facebook Live as well. So, you know that we begin our session at all times with our communal cipher. That's not something that folks on Facebook Live get to partake in, but certainly if you're in the area of Harlem, New York, we want you to come and join us every other Sunday, and you'll be able to be part of that. Because clearly we know that those of you who are following the Kemetic way of life, I know, because I know you all, that you've also been at some point that person that was unusual to in your family and friends, unusual in the group of people that you were close to, that you might have been doing your things quietly on the side, right? Doing things regularly in your own home, in your own places of work, to galvanize the energy amongst you personally is absolutely necessary. But something special happens when we come together. Something special happens when we gather together and recognize that this energy is one that is universal and is also one that we need to work on developing together as a group, because there's so many more things that we'll be able to do as we combine our energies as a group. And so we know that there are those of you who are doing this alone somewhere. Make sure you are gathering those people who are similar, like-minded with you in those areas as well. So I say welcome once again to our Kemetic Ascension, and at this point we usually go into what we call the word from the Sebayit. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Sebayit is that body of literature that our Kemetic ancestors put forth. Before there was writing in most other parts of the world, our ancestors were already writing these tomes on how to live a ma'atical life, how to live a life in divine balance, how to go about your daily work and still be glorified and still be living in the heights. And so that was an amazing contribution, but unfortunately very few of us have read this body of literature of the Sebayit. So we usually, in our Kemetic Ascension, attempt to draw from this body of literature so that we can be sure that we are hearing directly from our ancestors who wrote these great texts, in some instances, nearly 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Before all those other texts that we are more familiar with, the other spiritual texts that we are more familiar with, because of where we live and because of the dominance of the Western world today in 2017, the reality is that even that way of life was reinterpreted from texts that were written by our African ancestors in Kemet. And that part is certainly of great interest. But today, instead of reading something directly, I really did want to talk about some of the energy that is in the atmosphere today, at least in the West. And as a Kemetic priest in the West, that I'm not immune to those energies, right? It's wonderful to see you all, but I know that when you woke up this morning, you said, there's snow on the ground, it's 16 degrees. Do I really want to get out of my bed and go to Kemetic Ascension? Is that really what I want to do? Because it is truly, truly difficult to move around when it's this cold and when the weather is this inclement. And while you may not feel comfortable doing that, recognize that there's a reason why you're feeling that energy. Because in this portion of the year, we should be preparing to come forward in power. You know that we just celebrated in some ways the winter solstice, correct? Some of you who are are living in the Christian houses and the Abrahamic houses as well are recognizing this as Christmas and those sorts of things. But our understanding of the universe predated those things. So perhaps we would have called that Mes Heru. Mesem Heru, the birth of Heru. Masem Heru, the birth of Heru. You know that as we come forth through the solstice, we are in a place where we are preparing to guide that energy that died and now has been reborn. And so I think that particularly on the East Coast of the United States, there's a conflicting energy, right? You're beholden to this secular calendar, so you know the new year is here, so there's this new energy in the new year. But the same token is cold as all heck outside, and you really, while that energy is high, you still want to hibernate, right? There's a reason why you're feeling that, and there's something that we should be doing during this time to prepare for coming forward in the most powerful sense. In the most powerful sense. That energy that you're feeling and the feelings that you may feel with regard to hibernating means that really what you need to do is you need to direct that energy inward. It's not time to just sleep, right? But perhaps it's time to meditate. It's not time to just simply binge watch Luke Cage. Yes, Jabari Osaze still binge watch Luke Cage. But it is that time to direct that energy into your own life and into the lives of your loved ones and into the life of your community. So what are we going to do in this period so that as Ra begins to shine on high once more, we are prepared to do those things that we have been preordained to do. And so that is of critical importance. And one of the best ways to describe that energy is through the character of Asar. Those of you who are less familiar with our Kemetic way may know this energy more as Osiris, right? I'm sure there are some of you who have heard Osiris, right? Of course, that's a Greek name. Asar, some people say Oser, is the proper translation of the glyphs for this divine being. So who is Asar, the rectified soul? First of all, you should know that Asar is the first child of Newton Geb. Now, those of you on Facebook Live didn't see our opening of the way, but of course, Newton Geb is truly when this physical plane begins. That's when the energy coalesces itself into the physical plane. And so in some ways, the oldest energy that comes forth is the energy of Asar, that comes through the mother of the heavens, Nut, and the father of earth, Geb. And so he's the first child of Newton Geb. He's also the sister husband, the brother husband of Asar. And so some people are uncomfortable with the fact of Ast. This is all backwards. The brother husband of Ast. You know what I meant. And so why is it that we see him that way? Some people are uncomfortable with the fact that in our Kemetic myth, he is both the brother and the husband of Ast. And I always say that while it was not unusual in ancient societies for particularly half-brothers and sisters to be married because they were galvanizing a particular bloodline, keep in mind that I believe mythologically that there's something greater being said here. We're talking about Asar, and you know that in previous sessions we certainly talked about Ast. But recognize by calling him the brother and husband of Ast, our ancestors are telling us that the male energy, the Henanum energy, is not primary. And the sacred feminine energy is equal to it. And that is why Ast and Asar are brother and sister. They have equal doses of energy. This is not a story of a great man with a woman who simply supports this man. This is a story of a great man who in many ways is rectified by, in some ways, I would argue, a greater woman. Because we know as we talk about, and we will talk about the myth of Ast, Asar, and Heru in a few moments, as we talk about the myth of Ast, Asar, and Heru, the myth is more about Ast than it is about Asar, right? Pretty much at the beginning of the story, he's gone. I learned that story originally as the myth of Osiris. I remember reading it as a young man and going, Osiris ain't even in this myth. Where is he? You mean he's going to die in the first chapter? What happened? So that what we're being told here is that the feminine energy and the masculine energy are equal. And that in some ways, this is part of the way that I have said that the modern spiritual traditions have, and I say this in loving critique, that they've gotten this wrong, let's be clear, and that we've seen these traditions be extremely patriarchal. That is not what our ancestors intended. And so they read the story because they want to see the power of the man. And some people even disagree with me on that. But I say, well, when you go to church, do you see a woman leading your prayer? Some people say, yeah. And I said, well, is that unusual? Yeah, it is unusual. But if it's unusual, then something's wrong. Why is it that sisters should just be in the kitchen cooking up that fried chicken and not leading the rest of the population in spiritual uplift? Now, we know anyone who practices in spirit, I don't care whether you are in the Abrahamic traditions or you're in the ancient African traditions, you know that those people that tend to have the most spiritually connected outlook on life tend to be the women, correct? Mm-hmm. Have you ever gotten some wisdom from your mama? Sometimes you don't even want to hear it. I know my mother would say things to me, I didn't even want to hear what she was going to say because I knew she was right. How is she going to not be living my life and tell me about my life? Via remote. Call me at college and tell me what I'm doing. How do you know what I'm doing? But so we know that that feminine energy is closer to the intuitive side of ourselves. So we have to recognize that the feminine energy and the masculine energy are not, one is not subordinate to the other. In addition to that, Asar is Kemet's great ruler. He's a symbol of responsible leadership. And the great myth, which we'll talk about in a few moments, I might even ask one of you to describe the myth. Instead of having Jabari describe it up here, we'll see if one of you would like to talk about this great myth. We know that in this great myth, he is the first king, the first ruler of Kemet. And so in some ways, he is the symbol of responsible leadership, the symbol of that which is not just powerful, but powerful with a sacred purpose. And we know that sometimes our leaders are there really for ego and there to galvanize their own energy or to empower themselves rather than simply for the community. And so Asar is a symbol of justified leadership, which is difference in this sense. And here's one of the ways that I describe this to those folks who are less familiar with Kemetic spirituality. I know that I'm speaking to the choir right now, so the folks that are here are obviously already aware of this. But if Heru is the son of God, and I use that term, a Gothic term for those people who are more familiar with the Abrahamic traditions, then Asar is God. And so in some ways, as it is similar to the Abrahamic traditions, it's similar because the Abrahamic traditions have their source in the ancient African traditions. So recognize that as we look at Heru as that individual that has to go forth and do battle on this plane in order to save the souls of all of us, truly he is doing it on behalf of his father, Asar. In addition to that, recognize that Asar is killed by evil and resurrected to create an afterlife for all of us. Now, I say evil very cautiously here, because once again, when we look at the Western understanding of the world, evil is something that should be shied away from at all times. Evil is that which we should stay away from. In African traditions, we did not truly have an idea of evil. We had the concept of chaos. We had the concept of brute force. And those things existed on the lower side of our entities. That wasn't something that should be destroyed, right? It had to be something that was controlled. It had to be something that you came to sacred knowledge and understanding over, but it wasn't something that was to be destroyed. So, in this sense, evil is a Western way to look at the great story of the death of Asar. And he is also, in some ways, a symbol of the soul of us all. And you know that he is also usually depicted with a green face, because he is one who grows. Sometimes even a black face, because sometimes people say that he is the image of divine vegetation and the ability to produce. And that's one of the reasons why the energy may be high right now, but at the same time, you feel like you want to hibernate, right? It's very conflictual. But that actually means that, those high energies should be channeled inward. And that is sort of what we're seeing when we look at the green face, or even the black face of Asar. But clearly, there are those who also want to describe that black face ethnically. I don't believe our Kemetic ancestors were describing him initially ethnically, because everything that was great, everything that was powerful was black at that time. So there was no need to make a distinction, right? But clearly we know that as they depicted him in his oldest forms, we knew that he had extremely African features. Take a look at this image here. That brother's nose is as wide as noses come. And his lips are as full and juicy as African lips can be formed by the Creator. So this is the way that we depicted our divine entities. They looked like us, those people that gave civilization to the world. And these are the images. This is one of the oldest statues of Asar. And actually, I believe it's in what's called the Luxor Museum. So I have an opportunity to see it as a wonderful blessing to be able to see it every year. And I'll tell you that when I turn the corner and see this statue, I have to remind myself to continue to talk to the group that I'm leading the tour with. Because I really don't want to, I just want to be there with it, right? And spend time looking at it and feeling the energy that comes off of it, rather than leading a tour. So I know that, okay, when I turn this corner, I'm going to see that image of Asar. You have to continue to talk to Jabari. You can't just stand there and ogle at it while everybody's looking like, why is Jabari not speaking? That's the kind of energy that comes off this statue, and it is still present for public consumption at a museum, by the way, that almost no one goes to. Last year, they opened the museum for us. It was closed all day long. We had to call ahead to tell them that we were coming. It's not like we were coming at a time the museum was supposed to be closed. No one goes there.
How tall is it?
It's about 5 feet tall, and it sits on a pillar, so it's almost life-size. A beautiful copper statue, wonderful copper statue that really, as you look at, this is really, I should actually take my own picture, but I'm usually ogling at it when I'm seeing it, right? This is the one from the net, but you'll note that the way that it looks at you, it looks like it's communing with you. That's the energy that you get when you're in the room with this particular artifact, this particular depiction of the divine. And so hopefully you'll come with us one day so you can see it for yourselves as well. And then we also have this copper statue, which is also in the same museum, by the way. Take a look at the features depicted here. I love the symmetry of this statue. You see that he is wearing in both instances the white crown. Does anyone know what the white crown is called?
Crown of Upper Kemet.
Right. The crown of Upper Kemet, which is in what many would consider the South today. Of course, it's considered the South because when Europeans began to depict the world, they want to depict themselves at the top of the universe, right? Mm-hmm. And so we consider that area to be the North, right? But this crown, which depicts Upper Kemet, is called the Hedjet. Say Hedjet with me.
Hedjet.
You'll remember it because I always think the Hedjet goes on your head, right? The other crown, the red crown, which is of Lower Kemet, for those of you who are familiar with that, is called, does anyone remember what that crown is called? And that's the Deshret. The Deshret, right. So he is always depicted with the white crown. And you'll note that this crown seems to come through the ages. It translated itself into the Dagon people, and then eventually even, you'll see even cardinals today wear a crown that is reminiscent. Cardinals in the Roman Catholic tradition. And I believe also the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition have a crown that looks very similar, and it seems to be evocative of Asar's crown. Recognize that the Asar energy is something they've been trying to cultivate for hundreds of years. We'll talk about that in a few moments as well, and we'll show you how we are sure that they are aware of and are attempting to cultivate that energy for the power of the Christian church. Some of the names of Asar as being one of the oldest energies, he has 158 names. Now, what is in a name? Why is a name important? This is not a rhetorical question. Why is a name important? Identity. So a name really it describes something as distinct from something else, right?
Yes.
Why else is a name important?
It defines you, your purpose.
Yes.
Names also they explain what your reason for existing in the universe is, right? That's not the way that we usually give names today,
Yeah.
right? But that is certainly the way that our African ancestors and other peoples gave names for thousands of years, right? Your name should explain what you're supposed to be doing here. Because there's sometimes we get confused. Don't we get confused sometimes? So your name should assist you on your journey. So names are of critical importance. And Asar perhaps has more names than any other divine entity. Historians say there are at least 158 names for Asar. One of the oldest one is Kenti Amintiu, which means the foremost of the Westerners. What does that mean? What are they referring to?
The West, the valley of our ancestors, where you laid the bodies out.
The West being that place where those individuals who are making the transition would go to. And we generally would call that sometimes Amenta, right? The land of the West, the land of Amen, right? And so Amenta is that place where those people who make the transition go. And so he is known as Kenti Amentiu, the foremost of those people who have made the transition. And why is that name important? Because what they're actually telling you is that no one can make the transition unless he makes the transition. I know that as a Roman Catholic, I recited every Sunday that Jesus died to take away the sins of the world, and that he went forward in order to allow all of us to enter heaven. This is an ancient concept that doesn't reside in Judaism, it doesn't reside in Islam, and it certainly doesn't reside primarily in Christianity. It comes from the traditions that come from the ancient Hapi Nile Valley. So he is Kenti Amintiu. That's really what we should be hearing here. He's also known as Unefer, opener of good things. Now I'm going to tell you that when I am doing my own meditation, on those days that Jabari is not feeling like Jabari, on those days that Jabari is not feeling imbued with powerful energy, I usually do my meditation to Asar. And I, in those meditations, call him Unefer. Because I'm asking for the way to be prepared for prosperity, the way to be prepared for success, the way to be prepared so I can have victory over those things that challenge me. And recognize that if you know something so well that you know many of the names, you can call in a particular energy, right? So that is the energy that comes forward in my meditations on those days that I'm struggling. He's also known as King of the Living, Lord of the Afterlife. He who was permanently benign and youthful. I thought that was that's an interesting one that I need to do meditation on. He who is permanently benign, that only does good, and youthful. The Lord of Silence, the Lord of Love, and the one that I often hear. I hear our elder historian, this is the title that he uses for Asar most frequently. You'll hear Runoko Rashidi call him the Lord of the Perfect Black very frequently. By the way, we'll talk about the fact that Brother Runoko Rashidi is returning to the New York area. So we're hoping that you'll also be able to get to him. I believe it's February 11th, but we'll certainly be passing that information on. And hopefully you'll all be there with me as I'm there to celebrate his return to the area and able to talk about the wonderful work that he's doing as well. Now this one is an interesting name. And I shouldn't have actually put the translation there because I want you all to be comfortable with these names. Baned Jedet. Say Baned Jedet with me.
Baned Jedet.
That is a wonderful name. The Lord of the Soul of the Jed. The Lord of the Soul of the Jed. Someone tell me what you think that means.
Like the ruler of the souls of stability.
Those souls that endure. Those souls that... That's right. That's right. So think about what that means as we all hope to make the transition into the beautiful afterlife. This image of Asar, he is the Lord of that place that all those souls that are what we usually call Makeru, plural voice, go to. Baned Jedet. By the way, even though he is usually depicted as male, notice that as we say Baned Jedet, that we're actually saying that that energy is female. Do you hear the T at the end of the word? That term? So we're actually saying that energy is a feminine energy that allows us to make that transition. our Kemetic ancestors want to be very clear about the way that these energies took place. And we know that the oldest written depiction of Asar that we found is actually in what are usually called the pyramid text of the 5th dynasty of Kemet. The Merkuti text is what I usually call them, because we know that pyramid is a Greek word, a Greek misunderstanding of those sacred structures that our ancestors built. And so when you want to read the oldest depictions that are written of him, and I'm not saying this is the time that he is developed, that the concept is formulated, because we know, even as you read the Merkuti text, you're going to recognize, I believe I have a copy here, you're going to recognize that the way that this works is that those energies, those descriptions, sound like they're oral. They sound like something that someone is speaking to someone. And that lets us know that these traditions probably originated in oral form before they were written. So the image of Asar is ancient, before the written word. That's how old we're talking about. When you go to some of the earliest artifacts that come, actually not even out of Kemet, but out of Nubia, there's an image of a man sitting on a throne with the headjet. It's possible that that is a depiction of Asar as well. This is before Kemet comes into power. At the time that Nubia is giving birth to Kemet, at the time that Cush is giving birth to Kemet. But if you want to read the earliest written descriptions that are found, pick up a copy of what are called the pyramid texts. They tend not to be easy to find for some strange reason. They just, sometimes you'll look on Amazon, for example, and you'll see a copy for $100. Like $100? Then other times you'll see them for like $5 or $6. So if you don't have a copy, keep looking and pick them up when you can, because you want to read what your ancestors said about this sacred energy at the beginning of when they were describing it in writing, right? And so certainly you should pick up a copy of it. The center of the worship of Asar was at a place known as Abju. Say Abju with me.
Abju.
Now, sometimes often you'll hear it called Abydos. That is what the Greeks called it, right? They came into Kemet, they conquered Kemet, they changed almost all of the names, because they did not read or speak the Kemetic language. And so when you hear Abydos, know that we call that place Abju. And it's the burial place of those individuals who actually created Kemet, who put Kemet into union. That's where they came from. Some people say that Abju actually means the symbol of the reliquary. Now, I had to do some research to find out what the heck that meant. That's what the early Western scholars said that should translate as. What they were actually saying is the Kemetic ancestors in their great sacred myth said that as Asar was in different pieces, this is where the head was buried. And so different places in ancient Kemet would say that they had different parts of the body of Asar. And they would practice and really protect that particular energy. But this place, Abju, is the place where the head was supposed to be laid. Now, I think it's very interesting that as we talk about those different places where the energy exists, you could even look at today's modern Kemetic temples that way as well. So maybe Temple of Anu has a portion of Asar, and Shrine of Ma'at has a portion of Asar. And all those places that are trying to resurrect our ancestors' understanding of the divine are protecting a particular portion of this divine energy. And that's similar to the way that our Kemetic ancestors looked at that as well. Okay, I'm going to talk about that one a little bit later. Understand that Asar actually continues to be worshipped in Philae, that area that we used to call Pilak, after the Theodosian decree. What is a Theodosian decree? The Theodosian decree comes in the 3rd century of this common period, and it was a decree that came out of the Roman Empire that said that the Kemetic spirituality could no longer be practiced. So before then, you know that the Greeks came into Kemet at around what time? Anyone know? 32 BCE is really when 32 of our era, right? Before the Common Era. And so we're talking about for 600 years, what happened is the other traditions that grew up in the rest of that region, that were primarily European in some ways, were really drawing from Kemet. But it isn't until much later that they decide that you can no longer even practice Kemetic spirituality. That comes together in the Theodosian Decree. And this is something that you should know, because until then, you'll actually hear people who are practicing the other traditions, some of them that we know today. People who are practicing Judaism, people that are practicing Christianity. We know that really Islam doesn't come till later, right? We're talking about something that comes in the 7th and 8th century, really. But those people who are practicing those traditions were practicing along with people who were practicing the ancient traditions. It's a very interesting period, because they actually talk about the fact that what they're practicing in some ways is a reinterpretation of what you practice, beloved. Listening to them describe that is so interesting. Look at the work of Justin Martyr, and certainly Theodosian Decree is something that you should read. You'll begin to recognize that those traditions that today are considered the only way that you should be able to pray, you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. You know that your families are kind of like, baby, don't you believe in Jesus? What's wrong with you? You don't believe in Jesus? What's wrong with you? They think this is the only way that you should pray. Maybe they'll say, well, I'm Muslim. Oh, you're a Muslim. It's okay, right? Maybe they'll go there. What they have to recognize is that those traditions are much later, and we're drawing directly from those ancient traditions. So reading the writings of those people who are beginning to describe their traditions and describe why their stuff was the same as everybody else's stuff is always very interesting. Justin Martyr is the one that actually says, yes, I know that ours is the same as everything else, and we are saying that ours is true, but the reason why it's different is because Satan has a time machine. I mentioned this last Kemetic Ascension, right? The reason why we're doing the same thing that you've been doing for thousands of years and saying that ours is true is because Satan went before us to sow seeds of discontent so that when Jesus came forward, you wouldn't believe him because you were doing some other stuff. That's the argument that the early Christian fathers gave as to why your traditions came before them and why their traditions sounded a lot like yours. So reading that stuff that comes in that period before the Theodosian Decree and after is also very interesting. Now recognize that the Greeks actually decide that the worship of Asar should be revamped. Why? Because powerful people depict the divine force in their own image. So they say, we're going to actually create Asar for our civilization. And so what they do is they take an image of Zeus, right, which is also based on Asar. That's a whole other story. An image of Ptah, who was then called Apis to them, as the Apis bull that you may have heard. And they merged them to create what they called Serapis. This is Serapis. Now, some historians, some scholars believe that Serapis is actually the archetype for the image of Jesus. This man with long woolly hair and a long beard. In fact, you might actually think that you're looking at a Western image of either Jesus or God, right? Until you notice that he has the modicum on his head, the symbol of fertility on his head. That's the only way that you would know that you're not looking at a Christian depiction. So there are some, even the brother Dr. Ray Hagen actually draws back to Serapis as well. This is what the Greeks did in order to take control of the divine force. And it takes place in this period primarily around the end of Kemet. And so I also, and of course, recognize that Asar, being that being that was resurrected, is the source of the resurrection concept in all three major traditions. And you will know that he is if you just take a trip to a cemetery today in 2017. You'll know that when they talk about resurrection being something that they do in their traditions, but all the images they use for resurrections are images that come from ancient Africa. Every single last one of them. And so that's very, very interesting. We'll talk about that one in a second. Here's another image of Asar. Oh, and this is one of the best ways for us to describe the power and the potency. I'm going to say potency here, and you'll know what I'm talking about in a second, of Asar in the modern world. What are we looking at here? It's a tekken, right? And what do the Europeans and the Western world, what do they call this particular device?
Obelisk.
An obelisk, right? We call it the tekken, they call it an obelisk. Does anyone know why they call it an obelisk? It's actually because when the Greeks came to Kemet and they saw these wonderful devices, they said that looks like the little skewer that we use to put meat on the fire. You walk around Harlem and around New York and around the area and see those little shish kebab things, the mystery meat they're frying on the corner. Can you imagine, you look at one of the most sacred devices that you've ever created, an architectural and engineering feat, and you call it a shish kebab? So when you call this an obelisk, that's what you're doing. It's really, I think, in many ways, disrespectful to our ancestors. And it looks very simple, right? Understand that this tekken is so amazing that it's made out of one block of stone. We still don't really know how they were carved. We have no idea. Because they're usually made of granite, a very hard stone, and often there are no chisel marks. So how do they carve this so precisely without chisels? We don't know. There's some theories, but we don't know. Carve them perfectly. This particular one probably weighs as many as 300 tons. Wow. Did you hear what I said? 300 tons. How much does your average SUV weigh today? To give you a good idea of how heavy we're talking. About 2 tons. So your Jeep weighs 2 tons, this weighs 300 tons. And it was raised on its base, which is about 30 tons. You see this square that it's sitting on? About 30 tons. And guess what? Your Kemetic ancestors were showing off so much, displaying their engineering and architectural excellence so much, that when they erected them, that term is going to be important in a moment, when they erected them, they didn't even put mortar under them. It simply sat in divine balance and perfection on its base, sometimes for thousands of years. And the only thing that we know that toppled them is not an error in architecture and engineering. They'd be toppled by great earthquakes sometimes. So the very earth, our very father Geb, would have to shudder in order to toss these over. That's how amazing that is. And they wouldn't just put it out in a field somewhere. They'd put it in the middle of a temple, at the front of a place where people would be congregating. Can you imagine you do that? Listen, I have some floating shelves in this house. I don't even always sit under the floating shelf. I'm like, I'm not too sure about my carpentry skills. You're committing it, and that thing weighs, maybe there's 20 pounds on it, right? Can you imagine putting 300 tons above the place where people worship? You have to truly understand the laws of nature that we call ma'at in great excellence in order to do something like this. Now you might note that this particular tekken is where? Where is that tekken?
Central Park.
That's Central Park, right? That's the one that's here in Manhattan. It's just a short distance from where we are right now. Now you'll note that at the base here, do you see the base looks rounded? Well, when the Greeks, I think it was actually the Romans, when the Romans in Kemet, they actually moved this tekken from its original place. And they wanted to bring it to the place where their king, their Caesar, would come. But they couldn't re-erect it. They didn't know how to put it up. They could knock it down. This sounds very familiar. They could knock it down, but they didn't know how to put it up. So what did they do? They actually had some iron crabs made to pin it into its actual space. That's how they put it up. Amazing that even at that time they had no understanding of the architecture and engineering that went into actually creating this great spiritual device. So we're not just talking about spirit, we're talking about the implements of civilization. We're talking about mathematics, we're talking about science, we're talking about architecture. But some of the greatest implements of those things, of our great spiritual understanding, manifests itself in those sciences today. By the way, those are newer crabs that were placed in when it was brought to New York. The older crabs are actually in the museum. So they had to they still couldn't put it together in the 1800s, by the way. They still couldn't sit it in the 1800s. They had to go and make some new crabs to pin it together. And so, before I even do that, what is this? Let's talk about it mythologically. What actually is the Tekken? By the way, I'll tell you, when I do tours with young people and I ask them what it is, they begin to snicker. Because they have a sense of what it is, right? But they don't want to say what it is. And I tell them, well, what did you say? And they're like, I'm not saying what I said. Well, why are you laughing? I'm not telling you why I'm laughing. Tell me why you're laughing. It looks like somebody's stuff. I said, well, that's actually what it is. What? So tell me, Sister Angel said it's a henenum. That's what we would call a penis, right? The Greeks would have called a penis, right? We call that the henenum. So it is actually the penis, the henenum of a sar. Why is it the henenum of a sar?
That
Because
chopped up. Well,
that was the one they couldn't find. Right?
This is the one piece of a sar that could not be found, so it had to be recreated by who? By Asa or Set, in order to take in his divine seed and bear their children. So you'll actually see, I'm going to tell you that these are all over the world. These are depictions of a star with an erect penis, erect henenum. How come you haven't seen them in the museums you go to? For the same reason that those kids were giggling when they recognized what the Tekken was. Because the Western understanding of the human body relegates certain sections of it to be dirty. And your ancient African ancestors did not look at your sacred vessel that way. All parts of you were sacred. Simply read the Pertem Huru and Ger that says, all parts of me are divine. And it even talks about the different parts of your body, including your vagina and your penis. These are sacred implements. Now, of course, if we thought they were sacred, we wouldn't do nasty stuff with them, right? That's a whole other story, beloved. But clearly, this has to do with the way that we look at ourselves as divine vessels. So these statues of a sar with an erect penis actually are in museums all over the world, but I dare you to find one on display. Because the puritanical Western people are uncomfortable with it, so they don't. It's just not there. In fact, there's another statue that's in the British Museum of Min, the deity Min, another a deity of regeneration. And Min always has an erect phallus, an erect henenum. By the way, it comes from his belly button, not from his groin. We'll talk about Min in another time, perhaps during initiation, because this is a very sacred symbolism. But when it got to the British Museum, a wonderful, beautiful statue, life-size, with a life-size erect henenum. They put it on display and they became very uncomfortable because people with Western sensibilities were uncomfortable looking at a large, erect African penis. So what did they do?
They cut it off.
They cut the penis off.
No way. Wow.
Yes. They took an ancient artifact that was thousands of years old and they drilled the penis off and they store the penis elsewhere. That's how uncomfortable the Western mind is with their bodies and with your body, beloved. And so recognize as you see this, you should be comfortable with it because your ancestors viewed it as a sacred device. Now, what am I looking at here? Does anyone know?
The Vatican.
This actually isn't the Vatican, but we're getting there, Jess.
Wow.
What is this?
That's beautiful.
It's certainly, well, tell me what you're seeing if you don't know exactly where it is. What do you think you're seeing?
There's
It's a cathedral known as Saint Sulpice. They say Saint Sulpice with me.
Sulpice.
Does anyone know where that is? Well, this one is actually in France. And so what do you see in the back of the church? A Tekken, right? And what do you see on the top of the Tekken? What do you think that is?
Ra.
It's an image of Ra, right? They would have said the sun on the top. Now, this is an ancient Tekken. They put it there. Why did they put that there?
So they know when Easter will be.
Ooh, somebody been doing some research. Now, what is Easter?
Easter is the first Sunday after the first.
Now, see, I wasn't even trying to ask the complex, get the complex answer. But Brother Justin's been doing some research, right? He's been doing some study. He was giving us the 301 answer, right?
It's the first Sunday after the first.
Come on.
After
Yes,
the
yes.
equinox.
Yes, that is Easter. Now, I bet you that 95% of Christians today don't know that. They know that Easter moves, you know? I don't remember Mother saying, what Sunday is Easter this year? Because she had to know when she was going to try to get her money together to buy you that Easter suit, right? Right? it wasn't easy for my family, but she would do that. So she would need to know, is it late in the year or is it early in the year? Because I need to know how I'm going to get my money together. So they know that it moves, but they don't know why. It moves because of the energy of the heavens. This is actually astrotheology. And it was dictated in many older churches using a tekken. So the symbol of the resurrection of Jesus is dictated by a symbol of the resurrection of who? I'm telling you that they know that this is an Asar energy. They would like you not to know that this is Asar energy. But why would a Christian church, an old Christian church in France, dictate when their Savior will be reborn, if not on the symbol of when your ancient African deity was reborn? And so this is how they did it, actually. This is a diagram. There's a hole in one of the windows in the cathedral. And on the floor, a ray of Ra, a ray of Ra, a ray of Ray. Get this now. Get what I'm saying, right? When we say a ray of sun, we're talking straight Kemetic principles. You might think it's a ray of sunlight. Yeah, it's a ray. It's Ra. It's Ray. It's Ra. Because they're acknowledging where their understanding comes from. But they still would like you not to know. But recognize that this ray of Ray comes through that window and falls upon a space on the floor in that cathedral at the first summer sun at noon. And then in the winter at noon, this diagram is one I got from the internet. It's not actually precise. You'll actually see that it looks like it falls on the tekken, but it actually falls where on the tekken? At the top of the tekken. That's why you saw Ra on top of it, right? So a shaft of light comes from the winter sun at noon and hits the top of the tekken. Why the winter sun? Come on, Commentary. I know you know the answer because of the period we've gone through. Why the winter sun?
Well, that's the solstice. That's when the sun stops for 3 days, and then it starts to move again as reborn again.
So the first sun, you know Brother Amoye knew that, right? I've been sitting here, I'm asking questions, and he's looking around like, you know, I've been doing this for a long time, but I'm going to let everyone else answer. So we finally got an answer from Amoye. Take a look at what we're seeing here. So this ray of sun, when it began to move again after those 3 days of not 3 days of rising in the sun in the same place, rising in the sky in the same place from our vantage point on the planet Earth, on the third day it moves. Well, on that third day, a ray of sun comes in and aligns with the top of the tekken. It is a symbol of now our deity is either born or reborn, right? Because that winter sun would correspond more with which Christian holiday? With Christmas, right? So that's also why you'll see that they have the summer sun at noon. Because they're recognizing that what they are doing is they're galvanizing ancient African energy. Now, some of you are saying, okay, you gave me a cathedral in France. What does that have to do with the very structure of the Christian church? This is where Justin was going. What are you looking at? Let's go here first. Wait, come on. I wanted to show you another picture first, but it's not coming up first. But what are you looking at? What is it called? Does anyone know what this is called?
I forget what it's called, but it's based on
St. Peter's Square, right? This is the most popular place that people come because it's right in front of the chief facility of the Vatican, where who lives?
The Pope.
Where the Pope lives, and where the Pope does Mass. So the Pope will go to a terrace and do Mass in this entire circle. They call it a square. Please don't ask me why. The entire square circle is actually filled with people to listen to the word. But what is at the center of that space? Why is it there? Do you see the lines that irradiate from it?
Yes.
What are those lines for? Even today in 2017, priests come forward and look at the angle of Ra cast by the tekken to dictate when Easter will come. Even in 2017, that will occur. So you're telling me that the headquarters for the Roman Catholic Church dictates when their most sacred event will take place based on the shadow of the risen henonym of Asar? I once said at a lecture, and I would probably, Brother Ronnie said sometimes you have to know your audience. I didn't know my audience this time, Brother Ronnie. I said in the lecture that the Pope looks out his window and prays to the penis of a black guy. And the group was with me until then. Everyone said, yeah, brother. I said, oh. Room got quiet. I was like, oh, boy, I just lost the room. Tried to show the picture. This is before the internet was as prevalent. Wasn't no Wi-Fi. I was like, just trust me. And they were like, this brother just lost us. I did not know my room. Folks, you need to understand that is not hyperbole. That's not just African, let's feel good about ourselves rhetoric. That's actually true. That's actually true. This is the center of the power of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, some of you who are Christian that are not Roman Catholic are going to say, that's they church. Let's be clear. The Roman Catholic Church is one of the oldest Western churches that your church eventually split from. So their history is whose history? It's just like your grandfather's history is your history, beloved, right? The story of your grandfather is your story? Okay, you weren't there at the time, but it's your story too. So the story of the early Roman Catholic Church is the story of Christianity as well. Just because you're Baptist, just because you're Protestant, just because you're Episcopalian doesn't mean that this is not your history. It is your history. And this is how these sacred days were dictated today in 2017. And then let's talk finally about how this goes into Christianity as well. What are we looking at here? Anyone guess who that might be? Who's being depicted here? Adam. This one isn't particularly Adam. Why'd you say Adam?
Because it looks like fruit. It could be some locks with some tangled up leaves. I don't know.
That's what look. Yeah, right.
Grapes.
You're seeing grapes, right?
Grapes, yeah.
You see, it looks almost like there's an apple. That's why she said apple, because she saw it as an apple. But you see the other fruit here?
Yeah.
Those are grapes. So who is this?
Either Dionysus or Bacchus.
It's actually Dionysus and Bacchus. Mika's a ringer. She had questions in the back of the room, right? Now look at this. You'll actually see that this is a depiction of one of the early Greek and Roman deities that comes from a description of Asar. And so even today, our children will learn in school that Bacchus and Dionysus were gods of wine. That's the way that they're taught in school today. In the curriculum in New York City, that's what they'll learn when they go into world history and they talk about early Mediterranean religious traditions. That's what they learn. And so because they say he's the god of wine, they also say that his followers were always drunken, and that's the way they depict it. But recognize that I'm sure that many of you whose backgrounds were in Christianity like my own actually had to take sacrament and take in wine, right? Mm-hmm. So recognize that Jesus in many ways is also a deity of the vine. And so, but understand that Asar influences Bacchus and Dionysus, who influences Jesus. And then Asar also influences Jesus directly. So Christianity gets this in double fashion. I want you to take a look here at this image. What are you looking at here?
Sacrifice.
The sacrifice on the cross.
Ooh, you see a sacrifice on the cross.
Yeah.
So who do you think that is? You would think it's Jesus, right? This is actually Bacchus, who before Jesus was depicted on the cross. One of the reasons why they were depicted on the cross is not just the winter solstice, as we talked about in the last two Kemetic ascensions, but can you notice that there's not quite a cross? Can you see what do you think you're actually looking at? It's an anchor. Can you see the bottom? It's actually an anchor. And the tradition of ancient Africa was taken to the rest of the world by merchants primarily. So the symbol of African traditions being practiced in the rest of the world became the symbol of an anchor, which also was a symbol of the winter solstice. Recognize that all these symbols combine, and now they have been they've been reissued in forms, and we are not familiar with their ancient adherents. So this image is of a coin that comes before Jesus. Believe it or not, this actually image is in a book called oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the name of the book now. It's called the Jesus Myth. I'm going to remember it. And the thing that really is, you see I'm having a senior moment here. The author of the book was actually on our show. He lives in the UK. We had him on Comedic Legacy today via Skype to talk about his findings. But actually what he found is obviously these descriptions in Christianity came from an ancient African tradition. He calls this description Osiris Dionysus because he's saying that all of it is comes from Kemet, but it goes into the rest of the Western world and then into the Abrahamic traditions. And so this coin, they actually took a imprint of to put it in their book, and then when they went back to take a picture of the coin, guess what? Coin was missing.
Wow.
There are people who are very uncomfortable with these images, beloved.
The Tim Freak.
Timothy Freak. But the name of the book was what? I know he has the laughing Jesus. The Jesus Mysteries. The Jesus Mysteries by Timothy Freak. Excellent work that you should pick up. Excellent work. So you'll read more about how this moves into the modern world. And then of course, okay, cooperate with me. What are you seeing here? Asar and Ma'at, which I thought was very interesting, by the way. I need to translate the rest of this to find out why Asar is standing with the Ma'at. Is this a version of As, or is it actually Ma'at? Beautiful image. But what do you see happening with Asar here? I'm not asking you something complex. Look at the
Okay,
picture,
those look
y'all.
like grapes.
Do you see grapes doing what to Asar?
About to feed him.
Feeding him. Asar is also connected to into vino culture, into the creation of wine and the cultivation of the grape. And that's why you're seeing Asar coming from a sacred lake. You see this image as a sacred lake here? The actual grapes are growing from the sacred lake. This is where they were cultivated, and they are feeding Asar. They're going to his nose. They're giving him life. So recognize that this is not Dionysus or Bacchus. This first comes from Asar. And then, what are we looking at here? The picture on your left is actually a drawing of a portion in a book. But it's a recreation of it. But what do you think you're seeing? Come on, commit to you.
He's being watered.
He's being watered, and what's happening?
Oh, being brought back to life.
He's growing. I knew y'all was with me. Come on now. Come on. Since the angel went to the next level, he's being resurrected.
Right.
He is. Do you see the growth that's occurring? So this is an image of wheat growing from Asar, because Asar, sacred to Asar, were wheat and the grape. Now I know that as a child, I would go up to the front of the church and receive what? Bread. And so understand that this is a sacrament to Asar. They may call it by a different name, but this is an Asar sacrament. Own it. Beloved on Facebook, if you are actually still in a Christian church, the people in front of you they're in a Kemetic shrine. They belong to Kemetic shrines in the area. But if you're still in the Christian church, you better own that and understand that when you go to your sacrament, somebody's going to be upset with me. When you go to take your communion, you recognize that this is a sacrament to an ancient African energy that was known as Asar. Jesus is a new rendition of that energy. So why are you letting that European in the front give it to you? Okay, now I'm going too far. Let's just be clear. Let's just be clear. And then on the right, what are you seeing? Is that what you're gonna ask?
No, I was looking at the bottom, the picture on the left. It looks like an ankh and a wasp.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what is it saying?
He has power and
Life and protection, right?
Okay.
And so we're actually seeing that he is actually he's coming back to life. This is resurrection. So you're seeing that they are protecting life by growing out of the body of Asar. And of course, the body here is depicted in what color?
Green.
In green. In green. Which is the reason why, and we'll talk about this more when we go to initiation, as Kemetic adherents, I know that as an adherent in the Shrine of Ptah for many years, as a younger man, on Fridays, you would wear green. And today, if you see me on Friday, you will almost always see me in green, right? And so even, and so this is one of those things you do even when you're working in the Western world, right? You don't have to always walk in with your ankh to be connected to these Kemetic energies. Sometimes just the way you dress is an acknowledgement of those divine energies in the world that you are in. So Friday is this day of Asar. And so often people on Fridays wear green. I know Anika still wears she didn't tell her coworkers that that's why she was doing it, but eventually they said, weren't you wearing green last Friday? She was like, yes. Wait a minute, weren't you wearing green the Friday before? Yes. So the next week they would say, wait a minute, it's not Friday, but she's wearing purple. Wait a minute, she wore purple last Thursday too. So now they've begun to realize that even though she's going to work and doing the things that all of us do, I know there's some of you that think that Kemetic priests and Kemetic adherents must stay at home and smell incense all day long. No, but we have rent and mortgage to pay as well. We exist in the Western world just like everyone else. But what are those things that we do so we can live those lives like everyone else, but still recognize those divine energies in our universe? And so that's the reason why you see Asar as green. It's the reason why Anika's coworkers eventually said, now tell us why you're wearing green. Because you just say yes, tell us why. And so she explained. And now guess what? Some of them wear green too on Fridays. She's influenced them. So that's something that has happened. And you'll note that as you follow those energies, people recognize it when you are being authentically Kemetic, when you're being comfortable in your ancient African traditions, other people say, whew, I can finally take this wig off. Woo, I can finally let my hair down. Oh my goodness, my locks was tied under this wig. You mean I can be an African too? Yes, we're giving you permission. We're going to do it together. Let's hold hands and be African together. And on the right, what are you seeing? This is something Anika and I have been scheming to bring back into usage. And we still haven't figured it out yet because Jabari's artistic skills are still nascent. For those of you who are following on Facebook, you know what I'm talking about.
So it looks like Assad is holding up a man and a woman.
Okay. Okay, that's not quite what's happening here. But you are seeing Asar, right?
I see a double hat.
He's wearing you know what he's actually wearing? He's wearing the attack crown that he was wearing earlier.
Yeah.
It's the crown that it is the white crown that has two plumes on it. Why two plumes? Justin, can you pass me the statue here? I don't know why I didn't just show it to you. So you see, this is actually Asar with the attack crown here as well. So why are there two plumes on it?
The north and the south.
You can say that. I'm sure that, by the way, no, let me let you answer. Why else? Ma'atic balance, why else? You want to hear something interesting? Our Kemetic ancestors would have been comfortable with any of the answers you gave, because they really enjoyed the plurality and the duality in those definitions that came out of Kemetic principles. So they wouldn't have said, no, not that one, that one. They would have said, all of these things are reasons. But clearly, as we say he's the foremost of the Westerners, what happens when you go into the West?
They get white. No, I'm just kidding.
I didn't mean the West that way. She's so funny.
I'm just kidding.
What do we mean? What happens when you go into the West?
It's a transition.
And what happens what is the sacred sacrament that supposedly guards your transition, allows you to make that transition?
Your heart is light as a fire.
The weighing of the heart, right? So in some ways we're saying that he is in the hall of Ma'ati. He is I have no idea what you just said to me. He is, okay. He's actually dual of Ma'at. He is plenty, Ma'at is strong within him. And so that's another reason why you'll see those two Ma'at feathers on the side of his crown, which is usually called the Atef crown. Say Atef with me. Atef crown. So understand that that's what you're seeing here. But in addition to that, what are you seeing? Let me tell you. This is actually a figure of Asar that would have been planted with fertile soil. They would have put wheat grain in it, and they would have poured sacred waters from the river Hapi in it and done what with it? They would have closed it up into the tomb of someone making their transition. They wouldn't have cultivated to attempt to see the wheat grow from Asar. They would have known that the wheat was going to grow from Asar. So when you see them in museums today, you'll actually see these unusual looking images of Asar with brown grass coming out of it. That's what it looks like today. Because it was there thousands of years ago. So it grew, and eventually because it was not being watered, it withered away. But it's a symbol of resurrection that you will see in Kemetic tombs. This particular one comes from the tomb of Tutankhamun. I know that when I first saw it, I had to stand there and just look at it and say, what am I looking at? I know I'm seeing an image of Asar, but what are they trying to do? And I think, beloved, that what we should be doing on the winter solstice is we should also have these devices. It's something that you can do with your children. Kemetic tradition doesn't have to always be so cerebral, right? You can have them actually cultivate the grain from the body of Asar and then watch it grow on the winter solstice. It's a symbol of resurrection and renewal. And that is one of the things that we should bring back into use here in the West today. And now here's the image I was trying to bring up earlier, an image of the Vatican. So this image faces the Tekken. You can actually see it here if you look very closely. It's right here. And this, behind it, is the balcony that the Pope does his benedictions from. So yes, he does his most sacred preaching to his congregation as they stand around the erect penis of a black god. See, this is not the room that beat me up for saying that. But be clear that these are the symbols that you're seeing. And then finally, take a look at some of the images of Asar. We don't have time to go through them all here, but you're seeing, obviously, on the left, what are you seeing here? What's on the left? The Trinity of Asar, Aset, and Heru. In order, you see Heru, and then you see Asar, and then you see Ast, right, or Aset, right? And they're giving energy to Asar, correct? He is sahufied here. He is mummified here. So this is after he has actually gone into the West. Obviously it is, because Heru is here, right? Because he was bound to, his pieces were bound together in order for us to take in his sacred seed and then create Heru. So really quickly, does someone want to give me a brief description of that myth? Anika's like, you know that your phone is dying. We're going to be off of Facebook Live. Understand that in the story that we are telling, in this great sacred myth, it's a story of Asar as the first king of Kemet. Asar is known to have brought literacy, the cultivation of the grain, and the cultivation of wine, or the grape, into Kemet, and irrigation into Kemet. That's what the great sacred myth says that he did. And then as he does this, he finally decides that he's going to move on and to bring this to the rest of the world. And as he does this, he decides that someone should be left on the throne of Kemet in his stead. Who is it that he decides that should be on the throne of Kemet in his stead? Ast, his wife, his great queen. She was already co-ruling Kemet, so she is now the singular ruler of Kemet in Asar's absence. But his brother, who is known as Setesh, is one way I've heard it, yes. Sometimes you hear Sutek, right? But usually you'll hear Set or Seth today, right? Sutek or Sutesh are the oldest descriptions of the oldest translations of his name, right? So basically, he was very upset that As was on the throne. He's thinking that he should have been on the throne in his brother's absence. So when Asar comes back and Ast is successful, what does Sutek decide that he's going to do to Asar?
Chop him up.
He's going to murder Asar to take the throne. He does that. Ast is then told about what happens. She knows that Sutek is coming after her because if Asar is gone, obviously the people will expect her to take the role. So she flees Kemet. She flees Kemet with her sister, whose name is Nebuchadnezzar or Nbedhet, right? And so she flees Kemet with her sister, who is actually the wife of Sutek, by the way, which in some ways talks about the power of sisterhood, right? That she would actually leave her husband to be with her sister. And they go around the land, taking the pieces of Asar back together. And eventually, when the pieces are put back together, they find out that the Henanum is missing, cannot be found. Some people say it was swallowed by a fish. By the way, that's the reason why even in Egypt today, the people that live there don't eat catfish, because mythologically they said it was a catfish that ate the. Very interesting. Anyway, even today they don't eat it because of it. I went to a seafood restaurant. I'm a vegetarian, so I don't eat it. But I asked them, I said, "Can I have catfish?" They're like, "Oh, we don't eat that." I said, "Why?" They said, "We don't know why." I said, "Oh, I know why." I'll tell you the story.
Well, they also have periods, and that's another reason why some people say that they don't eat the catfish.
Did catfish have periods?
Yes.
Wow.
You mean menses?
Yes, they bleed.
Wow.
And you'll see them sometimes if you observe them. They bleed.
Wow. Wow. Well, recognize that these myths have translated themselves into the rest of the world as well. So anyway, Ast recreates the Henanum of Asar with Hekau, or sacred words of power. She creates the sacred Tekken. She's able to take in the seed and then give birth to Heru. So in some ways they would say that this is the world's first sacred marriage, sacred birth that occurs without intercourse, because Asar is past, right? They would call it an immaculate conception. I don't usually use that term because I don't think conception is ever dirty. If you're saying one is an immaculate conception, then what you're saying is an earthly conception is somehow dirty. Once again, it harkens back to the Western discomfort with the physical body, right? It is certainly a sacred conception. And so she gives birth to Heru, and she travels the land teaching Heru and raising Heru. And even though she's a queen in the most powerful ruler in the land, she actually has to dress in rags and clean people's homes to support her son without his father. We know that story is not one that's familiar today to your mothers, right? Who had to work as washerwomen in other people's homes. I know my mother, when she came from Guyana, had to do those sorts of things. Listen, we know very well that this is a story that is very present even in our community today, right? So she does this. Heru finally grows into a teenager, and she says, "You're almost ready to go back and reclaim the throne of Kemet," right? He decides that he's ready enough because he's a teenager. He goes to fight his uncle. They do great battle, and his uncle says something curious to him. He says, "You've really learned the martial arts very well. But what your mother didn't tell you is that I taught her." So Heru is defeated. He's almost killed, and Set tears the eye out of Heru's face. Heru eventually then, at that point, is laying amongst the Hapi. Some people think he's dead. And who comes to give him another eye, the eye of wisdom? Jehuti or Tehuti. So he gets this eye. This is another form of resurrection, by the way, the eye of intuition. And he goes to then receive the final teachings from his mother, Ast, and then he goes and does battle with Set, defeats Set, and does not kill Set. They decided they are going to rule Kemet together, but Heru will be the titular head and be in charge. Now, I know I've given that story in brief, right? And those of you that are here know the story in more detail. But recognize that this is a sacred myth, and there's so many different elements of it that can be used in our understanding of what we must do today to return to the throne. Sometimes I even say very simply that in order to return to the throne, they had to put the pieces of Asar back together, right? I say, well, we have to remember our ancestors. Remember our ancestors in order to return to the throne. That's one of those echoes of this great story that I feel. You'll also note that there's an image of Asar on his throne, actually in the Hall of Ma'ati, being sacredly held by who? The two ladies, known as
Ast and Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar and Ast, right? Sometimes they were called the beloved ones, so they both used the word, they were both called Mary, right? Yes, this is where we get Mary from in the Christian tradition, because they're saying that she is beloved, and these two ladies were known as the Mary as well. And you'll even see that on the bottom, you'll see a very small image of someone who's made their transition being led into the hall of Ma'ati, the afterlife, by Heru, who is showing them to his father, meaning that he has now made his transition. So understand that Asar is one of the, this is another image that I really like. I like this one. I think it's well done. I don't even know what museum this is in. I still have to find it. I believe it's probably in the Louvre, right, in France. One day we'll get there. But recognize that this tradition is one that is not just sacred, but it has found its way into the modern world. We even know in the story of the Battle of Heru and Set, you'll see echoes in many modern depictions. Like when you look at the Lion King, it's hard not to see the story of Heru. Look at the second Matrix movie. When the key figure actually loses his sight, right? But he's still able to see. And as soon as he's able to see, they pan across very quickly, and you'll see an image of Heru. So very clearly they're drawing from Heru, right? So understand that this story is one that has gone into the Western world in ways that are very interesting to me. And finally, I'm not going to go through all of this right now. But we talked about some of this last session. Here goes another image of that same church, the Cathedral Saint-Sulpice in France, which is very interesting. As we think about Asar in modern uses, I'm going to leave you with this. What are you looking at here? The Eiffel Tower, right? And as you're looking at the Eiffel Tower, you may not recognize that it is also consecrated to Asar, because the Eiffel Tower is really no more than the merging of the Tekken and the Merkut. And you know that France is a city that is certainly connected to ancient Kemet. If you just look at their coat of arms, you'll actually see that they believe that their knowledge comes from Kemet. On the front of the boat that leads people to Paris is an image of Ast, so that the French people really, truly believe that they are connected to Asar. So, what should you be doing in this period to prepare for Asar? Any ideas?
Generation.
You have this energy, but you also feel like you want to slumber, right? Clearly, this is time for you to prepare for what you're going to do powerfully throughout the rest of the year. In the period where you really don't want to be outside too much, right? What should you be doing? Does that mean that you should be preparing your home to be a sacred space? Does it mean that you should be preparing your mind for the challenges that you'll have? Does it mean that you should maybe take a course to prepare so you're better prepared for your occupational obligations? Be prepared in this period to go forward in strength. Be prepared to do your meditations on Asar. Next week we'll talk more about, next Comedic Ascension in 2 weeks, we'll talk more about how you can prepare for Asar in meditation form as well. Okay? Wonderful. We're a bit over, so I'm moving a bit abruptly. Let's move to the closing of the way. Anika, you want to come forward? And we're simply going to, yes, please stand. We're simply going to do another affirmation. Does someone want to lead us in that? You look like you're ready to. You coming? I'm looking at you, ain't doing.
Oh, me?
Yes. Now it's your turn. Shabbat it's your turn.
Oh, okay. Okay. Now move on. Close of admiration.
Now, yeah, say it nice and loud for folk, because now people online who have not been here are here. So tell us what you're doing.
Okay, so we are extending our left foot and our left palm forward to give energy.
Mm-hmm.
And we are releasing our right arm back and our right foot forward to receive energy. And this is called the pose of admiration.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're about to do now, the closing of the way, one way to do the closing of the way is the Amasu. So if everyone repeat after me. Amasu and Pater.
Amasu and Pater.
Sauksu.
Sauksu.
Emetra.
Emetra.
And Pater.
And Pater.
Autu,
Autu,
Aura,
Aura,
Maketipa,
Maketipa,
Harura.
Herura.
Give thyself to the one most high.
Give thyself to the one most high.
Keep thyself daily for the divine.
Keep yourself daily for the divine.
And do it tomorrow
And do it tomorrow
as you did it today.
as you did it today.
Tuanta.
To our return.
Now you know, folks, that while we are closed, we're not telling you have to leave, right? Spend time getting to know those other people who are on a similar journey. Spend time getting to know those people who will support you in what you're doing, and you will support them in what they're doing, because you know you no longer have to be that unusual person amongst your family and friends. People go, that person's a little bit unusual. Well, now you're with the other unusual people, the people that actually hear the echo of ancient Africa, that echo that must be broadened until it's a loud scream to the rest of our community. So spend time getting to know each other. And for those of you on Facebook Live, everyone, please say good day. We'll say Shemem Hatep to you, which means go forth in peace.